The second session has to do with associate status, and I think that's a very important session as well, in the sense that that is probably something that Cameron is going to try and sell to us. So we need to understand exactly what associate status means.
Thank you. Well, I can't promise you'll understand it at the end, but I'll try. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to say I will be able to offer a bit of light relief after John's masterly session, but I can't. I'm also going to be talking about institutions. And the particular institutional change I'm going to talk about is associate membership. So I'll tell you a little bit about what associate membership seems to be, and then also a little bit why it's important, and apologise for my little editorialising there on freedom lovers. So what is it? Well, it goes back a while. It actually goes back to the mid-2000s when there was some concern that the UK wouldn't pass the EU constitution, and an MEP called Andrew Duff, Liberal Democrat, started mulling over the idea of something called associate membership. That was then taken up by a German think tank called the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and also a group of MEPs called themselves the Spinelli Group, after the Italian communist MEP and EU federalist. And then in 2013 they published a draft treaty calling it the fundamental law of the EU. And there's a little quote from it there. Its main claim was that it was calling for a comprehensive revision of the Treaty of Lisbon, but would crucially be based broadly on the structures that the EU is currently made up of: Council, Parliament, the Commission, the Court of Justice. And it also had a long list of areas that it wanted to push for more integration, more authority at the European Union level. Quite a long list. More powers for the Court of Justice, more power over economic and fiscal policy, abolishing a lot of the what they term the messy opt-outs and opt-ins that various member states currently have. And crucially for us, or for this presentation, they also proposed the creation of something called associate membership. So you can find it in Article 137 of the draft fundamental law. Essentially, it's a second tier or a second class of EU membership. So the fundamental law proposes an inner ring of members, highly integrated, and then an outer ring who, well, the details of which I'll come on to in a moment, but an outer ring which is, well, potentially less integrated, but it would depend on the actual terms that each member state negotiated. So, just to get even more into the detail, Protocol 9 of the Fundamental Law sets out some of the basic rules by which associate membership would operate. Some of the key things are that whoever was in associate membership would have to respect and promote the values and the principles of the Union and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. As is typical with EU treaties, quite vague, don't really tell you what it really means, probably interpreted in a million different ways. Article 3 points out that no associate membership can prejudice the further integration of the other member states who are pursuing deeper integration. One of the clear implications of that is that a fundamental shift from the current situation where in those areas, for example, where there's unanimity, a member state can still prevent EU action, but that would all be gone under associate membership. And then Articles 4 and 5 gets into some of the messy detail about how a member state who was an associate member and not one of the fully integrated members would go about inputting into the continuing legislative processes of the EU, including, crucially, associate members have to recognise the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union, which is, well, as we know, is a can of worms, and one of the important implications of that is that it seems that associate members would still be subject to the jurisdiction of the CJEU, which I'll say a little bit about in a bit. So why might it be important? Well, I think there are two reasons. One is tactical, related to the forthcoming referendum, and then one is the strategic risks for the UK that come with associate membership if we vote to remain. So I think in the forthcoming referendum, and then thinking beyond that, particularly if we lose, we need to be thinking about what associate membership might mean. So in terms of on the tactical side, why it might be important for the forthcoming referendum, I don't know if anybody saw this story in Sunday Times a few weeks ago. David Cameron's secret EU master plan to come back with pull three rabbits out of the hat. One which was a rebadging, a relabelling of Britain's EU membership, sticking us in, quotes, an outer circle of a two-tier Europe, which is essentially the same as what the fundamental law proposes in terms of what associate membership is. And then the second one, late last year, there was a sort of a political pact between the Italian Prime Minister and Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, essentially saying a similar thing, that there should be a new model of EU membership, that it should be based on less integration for some and more flexibility around your level of integration. Again, very consistent with the terms of the fundamental law from the Spinelli Group. And the longer term, so this is if we lose the referendum, then the potential longer term impact is that fundamental law is likely to be the way the EU proposed to reform itself in order to allow the Eurozone to further integrate. And building on the recent five presidents' report, can't even say the word, which was about economic integration, but which fitted squarely with the broader reforms that fundamental law set out. So if we vote to stay in, then it's painted often as the non-risk option, but actually with the five presidents' report, with the fundamental law proposal, there's actually some incredibly significant change which has a huge bearing on the UK's position in any EU that we remain in, coming over the horizon. And at the bottom there I've just set out the initial parts of the initial timetable for the further integration process, which have been announced by the Commission as part of the five presidents' report. So we're expecting a white paper in 2017 to outline kind of what kind of change that the EU wants to see in order to further integrate the Eurozone. Interestingly, the UK take over the presidency in the second half of next year, so the UK government will have quite an important role in taking it forward. There will be a European Council in the autumn, which will no doubt start picking up this stuff and pushing it forward. And then the five presidents' report envisages it all finishing with a new treaty by 2025. So only 9 years away. An interesting part of this is the timing of the referendum. So if we get a June referendum in other words, the February Council that's coming up will agree all Cameron's terms, then we might expect one of those rabbits that the Sunday Times story talked about to be pulled out of the hat, which will be potentially is rebadging Cameron's terms as a second tier of membership. If the referendum doesn't happen then, but goes on until 2017, well, we then get Cameron's referendum mixed up with the Commission's white paper on taking forward the five presidents report and possibly taking forward the fundamental law as the blueprint for further integration, which case Cameron then gets a potentially very strong hook on which to claim that actually EU membership or our position in the EU will actually fundamentally change. But as about to say, it's not necessarily as good as it might sound, and certainly not as good as Cameron will paint it as. So, as I was saying earlier, the fundamental law is incredibly vague about exactly what it will mean particularly for the second tier or the outer ring of member states, i.e. the associate members. So I've just thrown up some initial questions on this slide here about what areas of policy would remain under the auspices of the EU and what could potentially be repatriated. Again, the fundamental law says that that's down to the individual member state who wants associate membership to negotiate with the EU, subject to those basic minimums about promoting and respecting the values and jurisdiction of the Court of Justice, etc. Which begs the question, what role will the Court of Justice have? Again, from the vague wording, suggests that the Court of Justice's role won't change from what it is now, which is basically it's the body that decides on the limit of the competence of the EU. So the EU will still probably judge the extent of its own powers, which you might describe as doesn't really resolve that conflict of interest. Also, what does promoting the values of the Union and the CFR mean? I mean, does that mean the UK will still be subject to the Charter of Fundamental Rights? Sorry, CFR's Charter of Fundamental Rights. In which case, that doesn't strike me as an improvement on the current situation. And also, what does obstructing or prejudicing the business of the EU and continuing integration mean? That could mean a great deal of sidelining, very little, even less influence than we have now, as John was talking about, the rather paltry proportions of voting power the UK has in the Council of Ministers or the EU Parliament. It could mean even less than that. So I think, in summary, that's associate membership at the moment. It's vague, but it's clearly got a lot of traction in Brussels. The Spinelli Group, who have drafted it with the Bertelsmann German think tank, are incredibly influential. It's got MEPs on like Guy Verhofstadt, and Martin Schulz, who's president of the European Parliament, Guy Verhofstadt, who leads the Liberal Group, so it's going to be it's going to be an important ingredient in the mix, and I think those of us who want to leave have to be alive to how it might be used, potentially both in the referendum, both in terms of how it could be used for PR purposes, claiming it's a fundamental change when actually it's not, but also then in the long term in terms of what that means for the UK as its ability to govern itself. So if we do stay in, what will our position actually be, and will that be potentially even less influential in the EU than it is now, which is not very much. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ken first.
What sort of mechanisms are there for switching between associate membership and full membership? I mean, is it done at national parliament level, or is it something that will need to be ratified and you would have to reapply to get to full membership? Is there anything put down on that? Because otherwise, we could get a change of government, it switches across, and the referendum here would be overwritten. That's my thinking.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's not entirely clear. So from the fundamental law, so I suspect the best way to do it would be as part of that renegotiation process that was taken forward, that was implementing the fundamental law approach, would be for a government at the time to say we want to adopt the associate membership element, and then kind of build it into the negotiation. But yeah, in the fundamental law, it's not hugely clear. It doesn't set up a specific process.
Okay,
but
that says a lot in it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it was Robert first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some Eurosceptics from different camps have actually called for the creation of a two-tier Europe and said, if so, if that's delivered, then we're very much in, quote unquote. Could this be what they're referring to?
Potentially. I think that's depending on your perspective, it probably does answer some of your questions. Depending on what the particular government at the time negotiates as the as what remains an EU competence and what comes back. So some of those people, I think, have talked about they want to see the EU as a common market only, and a lot of the other stuff, CAP, CAFP, Common Fisheries Policy, Home Affairs, Common Foreign and Security Policy, to come back to the member states. So, given how vague fundamental law is, you can imagine that is an option, but that's contingent on so many things, like the UK government being willing to ask for that, which the evidence so far from Cameron, for example, is that it's unlikely. And given that every government since Heath has been integrationist to varying degrees, it's probably unlikely we're going to get one that would be willing to ask for a lot to come back. But secondly, it would depend also on what those vague terms around respecting and promoting the values and principles of the Charter of Fundamental Rights means. What did that mean when it's actually written into a treaty? And also, one of the fundamental issues John was saying earlier with the EU is the fact that the Court of Justice that sits at the top of it all is so incredibly powerful and basically adjudicates on the extent of its own powers, and clearly that won't change, particularly over the areas that remain within EU competence. So I guess if you're not bothered about things like that and the incredibly broad way that the EU uses Article 114, then you might say it satisfies you. But I think for those of us who, think the EU is too powerful across the board, I can't see it coming close to satisfying anyone.
Will it come up at the European Council meeting this week?
I have no idea.
Okay. I think we'll just do one more question. I'm sort of locked on time. Yes.
Respecting the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which will be obligatory to associate members, is it possible that the UK would just lose its veto?
Well, I mean, we wouldn't have a... Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental law... So that suggests that the particular arrangements, the way a country will feed into the EU legislative process, will be something that that member state wanting associate membership negotiates. So it creates almost their own bespoke model. So it suggests that, obviously it's vague, so you don't know, but it suggests that the UK, for example, wouldn't any longer have any votes in something like the Council of Ministers. It probably wouldn't have any MEPs, so we wouldn't even have our small proportion of the votes in those institutions, which means where there is still unanimity requirements on taxation, except for that, yes, we wouldn't be there to use that. But on the Charter, I mean, we don't have a veto of the Charter. That's now in the treaties, so that is for interpretation by the courts and for the institutions when they legislate to legislate consistently with its principles. So
in some way, a heavy dilution of our influence.
yeah, well, a potential further dilution of already incredibly diluted influence, which, to my mind, suggests that out is clearly the better option. So this is part of the risks that are coming if we vote to remain. So.
Okay. Well, obviously, I think probably this left more questions than answers, really, on associate membership.
I did say I couldn't promise clarity.
But, so, but at least we've got an idea of what it all means.